The International Media Studies program at the Department of Communications at Brigham Young University presents another program in a series of panel discussions. Today's topic is Reporting the Military. Moderating today's discussion is Program Director John Hughes, Pulitzer Prize winner and former editor of the Christian Science Monitor.
I'm John Hughes. Welcome to the campus of Brigham Young University. This is the latest in a series of televised seminars on significant communications topics. It's sponsored by the International Media Studies program of the Department of Communications. Today our topic is Reporting the Military. We'll be discussing how well journalists do in covering the armed forces and how well the military does in dealing with the press. We'll be exploring some of the natural tensions between reporters who want to reveal everything and military officers who want to reveal less than everything. Our panelists are remarkably well qualified. They are Bob Sims. His career has embraced both journalism and the military. After gaining a master's degree in journalism, he became a career naval officer and ultimately Deputy Chief of Information for the Navy Department. Thereafter, the White House recruited him as Deputy Press Secretary for Foreign Affairs and the Pentagon as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs. Since 1987, he's been with the National Geographic Society, where he's currently Senior Vice President. He's the author of a book, The Pentagon Reporters, about journalists who cover the Department of Defense. He's also the owner of a community newspaper in Tennessee. Amos Joe Jordan graduated from West Point, went on to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, became a professor at West Point, and served military assignments in Korea, Vietnam, and other parts of the world before leaving the Army as a Brigadier General to become director of the Aspen Institute. Later, after high-ranking positions in the Department of Defense and Department of State, he became president and CEO of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He served on several presidential commissions, being a consultant to the National Security Council and a member of the President's Intelligence Oversight Board. Bernard Trainor is former military correspondent of the New York Times and currently military analyst for NBC News. During his earlier career in the Marine Corps, he had combat commands in both the Korean and Vietnam Wars and retired as a lieutenant general. For the past 5 years, he's been on the faculty of Harvard University, where he's director of the National Security Program. He's been a contributing author to various books discussing the relationship between press and the military, and he's co-author of the recently published The General's War on the Conduct of the Gulf War. Gentlemen, let me get us rolling with a broad question. How good a job is the press doing covering the military? General Trainor, how about you? How do you rate the press in coverage of the military?
Oh, I think I'd give them a C, John. I think one of the basic problems is that there are very few reporters today that have any military background, unlike a few years ago where everybody had served in the military. Today, they have not served in the military, and I think just given the culture of the journalist who tends to be an individualist and anti-authoritarian and intrusive, I think that they tend to be critical of the military unless the military can prove otherwise, and their criticism comes from a lack of understanding of the military more than any sort of animus towards the military.
Bob Sims?
There are very few really good journalists who know the military and cover the military. They're trying. I think the military knows the media better than the media knows the military. And although there's some trying, and the Associated Press has sent Suzanne Schaefer, their Pentagon correspondent, to the National War College for a year, they still have a long way to go to be able to cover the military with the kind of precision that their readership and public demands.
Do you grade higher than General Trainor, or are you going to give him a C?
In the middle, there are some very good ones, and oddly enough, at the Pentagon right now, the best journalists who used to be those who were writing for daily newspapers or wire services, the best journalists covering the Pentagon right now are covering them for network television.
Joe Jordan, what do you share the views of these gentlemen?
Well, I think I would share their views, except I'd make it a C-, I think.
This is getting worse.
Yes. A basic problem is that a soldier's life in wartime has been described as interminable periods of boredom, punctuated by brief bursts of terror, let's say. And all that time of boredom, you can't get a soundbite. You can't get a video clip that makes any sense. But if you're going to be reporting on the military, most of what the military does is that period of boredom. And so you have almost inherently a distorted picture, even with the best will in the world. And I think that this has only been exacerbated by video, by television era, where you cannot give context, you cannot give a sense of time and of process and so on. Everything is episodic. And so I think the distortion is inevitable, and it would take extraordinarily well-trained journalists to make sense out of this, and unfortunately they're in scarce supply.
Did I agree with Bob that television journalists are doing a pretty good job, but on print journalists, what happened in the Gulf War, which I think is instructive, is the Pentagon correspondents, those whose beat was the Pentagon, they were not allowed to go out to the Gulf to cover the war. They had to stay back where the decision process were made. And these were the people that understood military matters. Those that were sent out to cover the Gulf were largely garden editors and just routine journalists who didn't know the difference between a hand grenade and lemonade. And it showed when they got out there. It showed most appropriately when they would have the various press conferences and the briefings out there, and the ignorance of the journalists was extraordinary. So there's been no attempt really to develop a body of skills within the journalistic world other than in certain quarters of the television world to deal with military matters, because it's just not that important to most editors.
This was the first war in which we've seen live press conferences covered live and in their entirety, and in which the public has had a look at the reporters asking the questions as well as the spokesman giving the answers. Is the point you're making? And some of the questions were pretty infantile.
They exposed their ignorance.
Well, what should news organizations be doing? I mean, the problem is, from the reporter's point of view, is we haven't had any of these major wars where you have seasoned correspondents. You've got Peter Arnett of CNN and a couple of people like that rattling around. But as you say, you've got a lot of people sent out there to cover wars now who've never heard a gun fired. I mean, what's the training process?
They should recognize first that it's a real story. It's a real journalistic opportunity. A lot of reporters don't want to cover the Pentagon because they don't see it as a major story. But when the war starts, it's a major story. A lot of people don't want to cover the military because it's complicated, but it's all different kinds of beats. It's a business story, it's a hardware story, it's a people story, it's a political story, and you don't get that kind of breadth as a journalistic opportunity in some of the other beats in Washington or in local journalism.
So they all want to cover the White House.
They all want to cover the White House, and that's the worst place because you're a victim of the story of the day there. You don't get to build up a story. You have to work on what's current and topical. Maybe you get a little more ink or a little more attention, but for satisfaction, knowledge of the military, and the military is going to pay off, I think, for a journalist.
But you didn't answer my question, any of you. What should the news organizations be doing? I mean, should they say, Fred, you're going to cover the Pentagon for the next 5 years and get to know it inside out? Is that what they should do? Should they be sending them off to some military institution for 6 months or a year? How should people train to be war correspondents?
The military for years has offered opportunities to the journalistic world to come and get to know us, and to know us is to love us. Come out and see our exercises, come to our schools and sit in on the classes and ask questions. All this invitation has been a standing invitation. The journalistic world has not accepted the invitation, and for good and sufficient reason. The world of journalism is recreated every 24 hours. The news has to get out 24 hours. And in a day of constrained resources, and this affects journalism as well as it does anything else in society, they don't have the luxury of being able to free up a beat reporter to send them out to Fort Irwin to see how the Army mechanized units are going, or down to the 82nd Airborne Division, or out on an aircraft carrier. As useful as that would be in terms of broadening the background and establishing the rapport with the military, they just can't afford to do it. So they ignore it because it's not the story of the hour. It's part of that long period of quietude, and they only pay attention to it when all of a sudden the guns begin to boom, and then they look around for somebody to do the job and grab a beat reporter and say, do the best you possibly can.
You know, we sound like a lot of media bashers here, and it's probably not fair.
It's going well down that road.
This goes back to, it's not all the media's problem. It goes back to the Civil War when General William Tecumseh Sherman arrested and court-martialed a reporter for the New York Herald who was a lieutenant colonel in the Union Reserves. It goes back to World War II when the Chief of Naval Operations, Ernest King, said, first we'll win the war and then we'll tell them how we did it. It goes back to Grenada when for days the military were not, in fact, in my opinion, Grenada was a very well-organized military operation, a humanitarian operation. It worked. But the press were not allowed on the scene to cover it, and we've never been able to get credit for what happened there because the media were so mishandled. So I think the military is doing a better job, and I'd appreciate others' views on that in dealing with the press, but this history of hostility goes back a long way, and it's not all one-sided.
Well, let's pursue this other side of the coin, because you've all had a go at the reporters now. I mean, what should be the career path for military spokesmen, for military information officers? What should the military be doing to groom and train and select its?
I think the military is doing a good deal.
They're certainly trying to.
They have a better understanding, I think, of the media, as Bob mentioned, than the other way around. I think
not only at the spokesman level, if you will, at the person who's escorting the press and trying to take care of them, but at the senior officer level, where it's more important in your career now to be able to stand in front of a camera, express yourself, say what your mission is, and answer questions from reporters. And I think military officers aren't dumb, and they figured out that it's career enhancing to be able to deal with the media, and they've learned how to do it.
But they're still frightened to death of them.
Of course.
The telephone calls, you can be a general with the Medal of Honor, and the telephone call comes in and says, it's Mr. So-and-so from the Washington Post would like to talk to you on the phone. He goes white. The blood drains from his face.
Exactly.
As is the case with a bank director or somebody who is the head of a hospital. Institutions in America are afraid of the press, because the press is part of the unofficial checks and balances of the government, a watchdog. And people don't like to have watchdogs because they're intrusive. There's only one individual who likes to get that telephone call and smiles and beams when somebody says it's Mr. So-and-so of the Washington Post, and that's a politician. Because he will try to use the press. But all other institutions, including the military, are scared to death of the press.
At higher levels, you have General Schwarzkopf goes out and does fine briefing. I don't know they share that point of view, but in the Gulf War, you certainly have Colin Powell, who, as we speak, is mounting the world's most successful public relations campaign, you know, in all-time history. But that's at the top level. Isn't there a reluctance at the lower levels, other than professionals, like as Bob was at the Pentagon, but for military officers, young military officers, to be assigned to public information work? Isn't there a lack of enthusiasm for that? I mean, it seemed to me that in the Gulf War, for example, we can criticize the reporters in those early press conferences, but I didn't think that the briefing officers who were quickly flung into that arena were terribly responsive either. They got better. And it seemed to be
they got replaced.
They got better, they got replaced, and a lot of them didn't want to do that. So we hate this kind of stuff. Is that a problem?
It's certainly not regarded as a line career-enhancing assignment. Some of the services handle that by making it a specialty so that you can progress by doing well in that specialty. I happen to think that's the best way. because you can't expect someone to be a tank driver, an artilleryman, and then do a tour and do a good job handling media relations. It's too technical, too complicated. So it's not a job that if I were starting out to be the Chief of Staff of the Army that I would want to get.
But Bob, reflecting back on the Gulf War, I think the Marines may be a bit of an exception to this, because the commander of the Marine Forces, Lieutenant General Boomer, was in fact a former public affairs officer. I think the Marines have a somewhat different approach to the media than the other services.
Walt Boomer had been the Chief of Public Affairs for the Marines. He did a wonderful job getting the Marines credit. Some say more credit than disproportionate credit. And you see it happening right now in the Bosnian situation. The reporting that I've seen would have suggested at the beginning that the Navy was doing everything from those aircraft carriers. That's because the Navy was sophisticated enough to get reporters out there to give them the information, and some other services were not as ready to do that. Are we in agreement?
We are indeed, and the Gulf War is a classic case. The policy guidance that came out of the Pentagon to the field commanders was to be as cooperative as possible with the press, to give them every possible assistance. So that was the policy. But how did it work out in practice? Well, in practice, you've already heard the Marines knew how to do it. They were like the politician, that they were happy to have the press there, and they put no restrictions on the press. And when they assigned a Marine to go with somebody who was a journalist, he went to give him some assistance to help him to get his copy done, to answer difficult questions. On the other hand, the Army, despite the direction that had come from the Pentagon to be cooperative, and it depended upon units, but the unit that had come out of Europe, the 7th Corps, it was a little bit out of touch with the theme of America, apparently, because despite the guidance from the Pentagon, the officers that they and the enlisted men that they assigned to journalists were assigned more as keepers than as facilitators. And as a result of that, I don't think the Army got a fair shake of the good publicity that they deserved during the Gulf War, because they impeded the press rather than helping the press. Now, what do you do about something like that? It's a cultural thing. Here is the policy, here is the direction, but the policy and the direction depends upon execution and the goodwill of the people that are down where the rubber meets the road.
In other words, in the Gulf War, the Army's information officers were not sources of information. They were gatekeepers. They were
too frequently
census.
That was the case.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're still suffering from the Vietnam syndrome, where the Army felt it had gotten ill-deserved bad press systematically from a press corps that, first of all, disagreed with policy,
right,
and then disagreed with the operations, and then disagreed with the tactics. Up and down the line, and so the Army came out of that experience considerably jaundiced, and I think it was reflected in the Gulf War.
Yeah, I think all services had that same experience, and I think that's beginning to change as a generation of officers and soldiers and sailors come along who hadn't had the Vietnam experience, hadn't been turned off toward the media by that. But there's still a concern that we ought to get to about what the media do, and it's still right now in Bosnia, where a major concern at the Pentagon, after being as cooperative with the press as possible, finds that a network reports that the targets are going to change to a certain geographic area, and the defenders move artillery over there to defend that area. It's an operational security breach. It endangers lives of soldiers or airmen, and the military doesn't like it, and the American public shouldn't like it, and often reporters don't even know they're doing it. They don't even know they're endangering lives.
How do you get that across then? I mean, aren't reporters sensitive to this question of airing reports that may cause death and mayhem? How do you get that? How do you educate reporters to?
They say they're sensitive, but there's a story to be gotten, and there are big conflicts professionally between getting the story, getting it first, and may this impact on our military operations.
Well, I don't fully agree with your interpretation of it. First of all, there's no American journalist that is going to deliberately put at risk American lives. So generally speaking, if there is a leak in operational security, it's inadvertent. But ever since the days of the Civil War, where there were operational security breaches of an egregious fashion that shaped the culture of the U.S. military to be suspicious of journalists, goes back to the Civil War. But really, there have been relatively few operational security leaks that can be attributed to journalists. And the few that do exist, generally speaking, are inadvertent. So what's the protection against that? With print journalism, the newspapers and the magazines, it's relatively easy, and it's called editorial observation.
You have a little time, too.
It's adult supervision that comes on the part of an editor, so that even if he has a cub reporter out there who's trying to get the Pulitzer Prize and he's got a red-hot story, and he doesn't realize its security implications, an editor can tamp that down. For example, everybody that was in the Gulf knew about this big buildup in the West before the attack against the Iraqis. But there were no leaks, no reports that come out of the Gulf on that. There was speculation, but the speculation were by journalists back in the United States, not people on the scene. So there's that adult supervision that I think that editorial coverage gives you to protect operational security. But that has changed with technology, with the instant television, where it's kind of raw sewage coming in and coming directly out to the people. And how you protect against that, I think that's a problem that we haven't really solved yet. And it's going to get worse before it gets better.
It's a problem, and also there's a problem with our own military and civilian leadership who have access to information and provide this, leak this, if you will, to members of the press. What are you going to do if you're a member of the press and an official tells you that such a thing is going to happen? You may well report it. And you're at fault, not the reporter, in my opinion. We need to do a better job within the government of making people keep their mouths shut when they should.
In some cases it goes beyond simply telling you that something's going to happen. It's a question of an official or a military officer saying something's going to happen and you need to publicize this for an agenda that he might have that is not quite clear. I mean, that's right. Why a reporter has to say, why is he telling me this? Why does he want me to do this? Right. So, check your sources.
You've been a reporter and been there for that, you know.
Bob, you were the Pentagon's spokesman. Were there ever occasions when somebody suggested that you should lie?
No, I never had. I never was asked to lie. That is not the policy of the Department of Defense. It shouldn't be the policy of the government. Basically, the policy of the government on military matters, like everything else, should be we're working for the taxpayer. He has a right, she has a right to know what we're doing. But I was never asked. I may have been given misinformation. Mm-hmm. I may have delivered it. But I tried to be a reporter myself and find out, verify before I went with something, be sure my sources were as good as they could be. Because I'm sure there are people who think, and let's face it, in conflict after conflict, there have been deceptions through the media. The British did it beautifully during the Falklands. That's not the way we do it. And if we want to have a kind of trust between the media that will get them to cooperate, I think our policy is the way to go.
But you have to draw a line. There are certain topics, certain movements that you're not going to discuss.
You don't talk about future operations.
That's
right. You don't talk about future operations. You don't talk about
intelligence sources and methods.
Exactly.
I think the presumption
Some things
should
that
be,
are simply no comment questions.
and journalists understand that.
Yes,
but I think the operating presumption should be that the American people are entitled to free and open knowledge of what's happening with an institution that they are investing their sons and daughters and their tax money into. That's the presumption. So if you're going to restrict that information, that right to know, then there has to be some overriding consideration to override that presumption. And operational security is usually the major one. Classic case of that. Look at the amount of resources that were going into the development of the atomic bomb during World War II and the Manhattan Project. and you didn't want the American people to know about that or the rest of the world to know about it. And yet it was enormously expensive. Well, the presumption of free and open knowledge on the part of the public was overridden by the need for security. And so I think that's kind of the rule of thumb. But to use the idea of operational security as a shield behind which you
cover up mistakes.
Cover up mistakes or embarrassment or something like that, that I think is the wrong way to go.
I was, just in doing my homework for this program, I was rereading General Schwarzkopf's book and reading Colin Powell's book, and came upon the story where Schwarzkopf went on TV with a briefing and said, we knocked out 4 Scud missile launches. And a day later, the overheads came in, and Colonel Powell and his team said, they weren't Scud missile launchers, they were Jordanian gas tankers at a rest stop. And then the debate was, well, do we fess up? Do we fess up we made a mistake? Well, they didn't want to get Storm and Norm upset, and they didn't want to do this, so they said nothing. And 2 days later, crew on the ground for CNN photographed the destroyed tankers and said, these weren't Scud missile launches.
Listen, bad news, like fish, starts to sink in 3 days. And if you commit an error or do something that's absolutely egregious, admit it. Then it's in the newspaper for 1 day. But if you try to cover it up, then it's not the sin that you've committed, it's the cover-up that becomes the news, and that hangs around for 3 or 4 days or more.
Yeah, yeah.
There's so much cooperation. We talk about an adversarial relationship between the military and the media, but there is so much cooperation on both sides that probably neither wants to talk about or admit. And I find that journalists are, American journalists are just as patriotic as everybody else. And you go back, we always talk about World War II and a common purpose and so forth, but I can remember being in the Pentagon during the Cuban Missile Crisis when everything was moving to Florida and we thought there was going to be war, and we had reporters and editors calling us, seeing the movements of troops and equipment, saying, should we report this? And if we said no, they didn't. If we now have a system of pool where we can call out members of the media pre-selected and tell them something's going to happen. Show up at this place and we'll take you there, and you'll be able to cover it so that the public knows what's going on. And it works.
Yeah.
Well, it's a question in my mind, however, whether the system which developed out of World War II and which we saw working very nicely, as you say, in the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on, hasn't, under the twin impulses of Vietnam and TV journalism, however, been blown out of the water. Whether that system is any longer in place, and we still have press pools, and sure, the coverage of the Gulf War, in I think most people's minds, was really well done, and it was a successful example, despite the Army gatekeeper syndrome. It was a successful example of cooperation, collaboration between the military and the media. But I'm just a little hesitant to draw any large conclusions from the Gulf War, which was a 100-hour war, whatever it was. We didn't have the protracted battles and the casualties and the rest of it that it seems to me are likely to be the driving force in media coverage in future wars. If you just take the case of the helicopter pilot that was dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, and it caused the Clinton administration within a week to change American policy in Somalia, to my mind, disastrously. And I think we've yet to see the full consequences of that, although we saw some of it in Haiti in an earlier period. That kind of an instantaneous television coverage of carnage, it seems to me, puts you in a different state of media-military relations than what you're talking about, World War II or the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And even the idea of media pools where you've got cooperation between the news organizations and the Pentagon about what they'll do. Sure, that works beautifully in exercises. It has worked well in some instances where our forces did well. Will it work? Will it hold up when we go in and there's a disaster? That's the real test.
I guess the point you're making, Joe, is if at the time of the Civil War we'd had television coverage and Christiane Amanpour had been doing stand-ups on the battlefield, would the American people have stood for it, and would we have taken those casualties, and would the war have gone on as long? Well, it is, one regrets the loss of life, and it was a terribly unfortunate situation in Somalia. But when you have this instant television coverage, doesn't it make commanders terribly nervous about taking casualties? Aren't you in a great deal of trouble?
You have to do it right the first time.
Do it right the first time.
Yeah.
Well, you don't do it right the first time. I mean, war is a messy business. Believe me, I know. I've seen it from the bottom on up. Things are confused. Everything gets screwed up. You never do everything exactly right. You don't have to go back to the Civil War to say if television was covering a conflict, the public view may have been different. Think of some of the screw-ups in World War II, where in the parachute landing in Sicily, we shot down most of our own planes and most of our own paratroopers out of the sky because of the miscommunication. Some of the heroes that we took out of World War II, if they had television at the time, particularly near real-time television, instead of being heroes, they would have been pilloried villains. It's a messy business, but you know, I think we underrate the American public when we say the American public doesn't understand this and they have to be protected against things, and that the American people won't tolerate casualties. Good Lord, we have a history of taking casualties. Look at the Civil War, look at World War I, look at World War II. The American people aren't afraid of taking casualties. What they get upset about is if they consider them to be useless casualties in a mission that doesn't make any sense to them, where they've done some sort of a cost-benefit analysis in something that is a war of election as opposed to a war of survival. That's what they get upset about. So when you take a look at the situation in Mogadishu, it wasn't the fact that there was a dead American there, although the desecration of his body was upsetting, but there was a time when American people, instead of saying get out of there, would have said that's terrible, let's go in and clean up those buggers that did that to the American soldier. What was really being called into question was the validity of the mission down there that would lead to the casualties.
And we'll never know how many political decisions were made correctly. That is, we're not going to go into this with armed forces. We're not going to commit American troops because there was a concern that the American public would know what was going on.
Exactly. Well, I go back to Vietnam, which I guess was our first television war, but it did seem to me that you had gruesome pictures of battlefield action coming into American living rooms, but the film was shot at the front. It was shipped back to Saigon. In those days, it was put in a bag on a plane and went to New York. And a couple of days elapsed for reflection, editing, reconsideration before it actually aired. Starting with the Gulf War, correspondent gets up live and says the Scuds are coming in and they've got chemical warheads, and 20 million people panic, or maybe go to the refrigerator to get the drink, or go to the bathroom, come back and miss the correction. Oh no, sorry guys, it turned out they weren't chemical.
But you know what, John, we're not going to do much about that. I mean, this is
well,
the fact of
and,
life, whether you're in business, war, or whatever. We've got this instantaneous communications, and it's troubling. But what can we do about it?
I don't think you can turn the clock back, but I think thoughtful men and women in the media have to try to devise some safeguards. The other incident you talked about, the 82nd Airborne in the Gulf War, and again in Powell's book, I was reading that a correspondent went live with the story that the 82nd Airborne had just engaged in an artillery duel with the Iraqis. And Schwarzkopf went ballistic and said, how could she do that? Isn't there an escort officer there? And the answer was, yes, there was an escort officer there, but she said it on the air into the satellite before he could stop her. And what was the problem? The problem was nobody was supposed to know the 82nd Airborne was
but
was
wait
there.
a minute. Let's analyze that for a second.
Okay.
Here, the 82nd Airborne Division is shelling the Iraqis, and we don't want the American public to know that the 82nd Airborne Division is over there because nobody is supposed to know they're over there. The Iraqis know they're over there. They're being hit by the artillery.
But they might not have known which.
They don't know it's the 82nd Airborne. They may not know the actual force that's deployed on the left wing, which is going to be, of course, the enveloping wing. So it may be that there was good and sufficient reason for Schwarzkopf to try to conceal the presence of the 82nd Airborne. My concern here is that CNN wars, if that's the proper terminology, and I think it may well be CNN wars, that the military, if it has not already worked out a cooperative and collaborative relationship with the media, if you don't already have a media that's sophisticated enough to know what can be said on satellite instantaneous transmission and what shouldn't be said, that you'll never be able to get this thing right in the heat of a conflict. It's this long period of boredom that we talk about rather than those moments of terror that we've got to get this relationship right. And as far as I can see, very little progress is being made.
It really needs attention because demographically the press corps covering military matters has changed, just as demographically it's changed in every institution. Young people aren't going into the military and learning something about it and coming back and then doing a profession that applies in journalism. So unless there's a conscious effort to educate journalists about the military and they to educate themselves, then we're going to have this kind of situation. I think it's one of the key things that should be addressed by both the military and the journalistic community.
Well, General Trainor is teaching a course on the media and the military at Harvard.
How you doing?
I wonder if a lot of media
headway?
people there, are they mostly military people or?
Oh, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
It's a mixed bag. But the problems that we face right now are going to pale compared to the problems that we face with what I would describe as the transnational media. You can depend upon a certain degree of American patriotism on the part of journalists, whether they know anything about the military or not to deliberately do something that is going to impact adversely on the military. But what happens now when you have this transnational press, which services not a particular country, services all countries, and employs all the different nationalities, and they are equipped with the latest technology which allows them to give real-time coverage from the battlefield.
Sure.
And they have absolutely no concern over the life or death of an American soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine. How are we going to deal with something like that? The problem of dealing with our own national press has always been difficult. I would say that we're at the threshold of something that's damn near impossible to deal with.
And we've got thrown into the mix a transnational, if you will, command structure, because who would have thought that we would be fighting as a part of NATO anywhere? NATO having, it's a wonderful organization, but it's a very bureaucratic organization with a lot of countries who have different ideas, completely different ideas from ours about what to do in press relations. So these problems are enormous, and they're with us right now.
How do you rate the trust level at the moment between press and military? I mean, I guess it was pretty high in World War II. You pretty much could talk to a correspondent and say, such and such an operation is going to happen, but you can't write about it until I tell you. And you.
But you get censored if you do.
But you get censored if you do. That's right. Vietnam, I guess, was the bottom of the trough. There was, there certainly were correspondents that you would not entrust with that information in Vietnam.
Well, there was a lot of trust between reporters and
in
troops
Vietnam?
there in Vietnam. There really was a lot.
In the early and middle stages. Where it started to come apart was at the end of the war, where all the quality journalists were not covering Vietnam anymore, and you had a lot of stringers and freelancers out there who were trying to make a name for themselves and trying to make a buck. And they read the public sentiment as being anti-war and anti-military, and that's what they were going to feed.
So where do you think it has gone now, after hitting bottom maybe in Vietnam? Where do you think?
Well, I think it's moving.
You think
back.
it's improving?
I think it's improving. And sometimes, and when I go and talk to military people about the press, sometimes I think it's improved too much because they think, well, if we just get to know each other, everything will be all right. Well, not necessarily. There are conflicting interests there. You have to know each other, but that doesn't mean everything's going to be all right.
Love each other. What do your students come out of your class? How long are they in the tuition process there?
It's a semester course.
A semester. What do they come out of it with? How are they changed in their attitudes?
Oh, I think they are a little more understanding of the tensions that exist between the military and the media, and that this is a good thing. Because it is the fourth estate is kind of part of the watchdog system of American institutions. I think they appreciate that. They appreciate how we got to where we are, which is largely a historical and cultural affair, and I describe it in terms of rounds in a boxing match. The first round, which basically would be the Civil War, went to the journalists. They got the better of the military. And we have gone over the period of time. Clearly, the Vietnam War is viewed by the military as being a round that was won by the journalists. And then you get Panama, and you have Grenada, and you have the Gulf, and the journalists all think that the military won those because they had total control over the journalists and were able to manipulate the journalists in their terms. So you have to understand that this thing is ebb and flow, and at certain points the relationship is terrible between the military and the media, and at other times it's not too bad. And I think we have grown out of that terrible period from Vietnam. I think we've worked our way through some of the rough spots that were reflected in Grenada and Panama, made certain improvements in the Gulf War. And I think right now, as far as journalists are concerned, it's off the front burner. They don't care. As far as the military is concerned, I think they feel that they have learned how to deal with the press and that they now have the upper hand, and I'm inclined to agree with them.
Yes, as one reporter who covers the Pentagon said to me, the military and the media, it's over. They won.
They won. At least this round.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's, as far as the military is concerned, they don't really believe they've won at all. We have ongoing study groups at each of the war colleges, service war colleges, of how to deal with the media. They consider this to be a continuing battle. I don't know whether it's a 10 or a 15-round fight, but it's a continuing one.
Well, how do you see that unfolding? I mean, we've got the pool concept, and we had the escort concept in the Gulf War. Where do you think it's going? Do you think it's going to depend on the character of the war?
Oh, I think so. I think it depends on the length of the war, the amount of public support there is for it initially, where it is, what kind of casualties we take. It's hard to predict, but there's going to be this tension, and there's going to be a lot of instantaneous information. We now have the internet involved in the Department of Defense. All of its information, its news releases, other information, is instantly available on the internet. There's just a lot of information out there, and Americans had better get used to knowing more than they want to know about some things, including about what's going on with the military.
In retrospect, do you think the Gulf War formula will reappear somewhere, or do you think that the American public was a little ambiguous about that? As I remember the polls at the time, they were perfectly happy to have the press restricted.
Yes, that's right.
Sure.
Colin Powell says 80% favored the way it was handled.
But on the other hand, in general, they want openness, and they want full coverage of the military, and there's a conflict between.
In general, but I agree. I think the public polls or public opinion does not want the press to be able to do things that would endanger military operations. They don't, and any reporters who think that they do are mistaken, in my opinion. So there's that going in, but there's still going to be more information out there than the military is going to want.
But you know, you have to remember that this is just one slice of a large pie. And the large ply is the presidential decision to employ U.S. military forces. And the relationship between the military and the media has to be seen in the overall context of what the presidential policy is in public policy. The American people, when an American president commits military forces, rally around them right away and give them the benefit of the doubt and support them in the initial stages. But then they ask the question, okay, we've supported you now, tell us why you did this and why it was the right thing to do. That's when they start their cost-benefit analysis, of which the press is a very important part. So then it is really up to the president and his administration to make the case for what they did. And frequently they are incapable of making the case, and that's known as public diplomacy. And that should be one of the principal things that a president's office should be concerned with when it makes decisions that entail the risk of life and limb for American forces.
Well, I think that that's dead on, but I'd add the point that Jim Schlesinger, the former Secretary of Defense, has a big badge when he's asked to explain American foreign and defense policy, current Clinton administration. He displays the badge which says, TV made me do it. And the presidential decision is very often, very heavily influenced by the coverage that you had in the first place of the particular incidents or processes that are underway, such as Bosnia, the pressure to do something about Bosnia, or to get into Rwanda and help, et cetera, et cetera. These presidential decisions, and to get out of Somalia, are largely driven by TV. So it's an interactive
No
process.
administration has a monopoly on it. I think in the Gulf War situation...
Well, I wouldn't say that Jim was necessarily, as a Republican, a dispassionate critic of the Clinton administration.
Exactly, no. But in the Gulf War, I think the Gulf War, without media coverage and the anticipation of more media coverage, might well have gone longer, been different, and who knows what the outcome would have been. But I think politicians at the White House and elsewhere were well aware of what would happen if things started going unraveled in that area. So they ended it, and who knows whether they ended it too soon or not. I don't want to get into that discussion, but they ended it. And I think part of that was because of fear of public pressure.
Are we entering an era of superstar generals as spokesmen now? We have Colin Powell out there selling books. We have Schwarzkopf.
Well, Colin, I know him and admire him, and I've served with him and think the world of him, but he's a little different. You look at Admiral Bill Crow, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a wonderful man, wrote a book, had a very successful speaking career. Norm Schwarzkopf, same thing. I think probably Colin has dimensions that your normal military officer doesn't have, and we're going to see more of him in different venues than we've seen of others. Generally, a military officer has a story to tell, he tells it, and then that's it. But Colin may be different.
You have some thoughts about...
Well, Colin Powell has been called a political general, and presumably that's bad. But I mean, if you're going to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you have to understand a little bit about politics, and he certainly isn't the first political general to come down the pike. I mean, you have George Marshall, you have Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur. They were all, in a sense, political generals. I think the distinction with Colin Powell is that he had spent, in a sense, more of his senior years in the military outside of the military in a political environment than his predecessors did. The Bill Crow and his predecessor, who was General Jack Vesey, they had all made their spurs and made their mark strictly within the military route, whereas Colin Powell made his mark in a politico-military setting. And most of his judgments and recommendations during the Gulf War were primarily driven by political considerations rather than by military ones, including the recommendation to the president to end the war. So there is a political dimension to Colin Powell that makes him different from the standard chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that we have historically had. And I think his popularity at this time is a reflection not so much of his talents, although he certainly has talents, but I think it's a reflection of the absolute hunger on the part of the people in the United States for some sort of a hero, whoever that hero may be.
He could shift foreign policy and military policy, could he not? I mean, he's persuasive enough to get on national TV and assert that a certain policy that had been thought to be incorrect is correct, and he could shift public opinion.
Well, I think he has, frankly, and frankly I see a danger in it, because he has, under what has been called the so-called Powell Doctrine, where he specifies when U.S. military forces should be used, what conditions have to be met, and if those conditions are rigidly applied, as noble as they are in themselves, but if they're rigidly applied, you never use American military force. And to, in a sense, to have the military institution of the United States tell the President of the United States, whether it's the current President or any President, now here are the conditions that have to be met, Mr. President, before you use this military, of which you are the Commander-in-Chief. I don't think that that's particularly helpful. I don't think it is, and particularly if you have somebody who is a potential adversary out there, and he knows this restrictive nature of U.S. military force, and this fear of maybe casualties because of this will turn against American policy, then he's able to do all sorts of mischief without fear of interference. I don't think that that is a very good policy, and I would like to see, if Colin Powell is serious about entering the political field, that he clear that issue up completely.
Joe, Bob, you have...
Well, I would just say I think Colin Powell's case is called the Powell Doctrine, but really is the Weinberger Doctrine, and Colin adopted, and he made it plain in the context of the Gulf War and since, and particularly here he was talking about Bosnia, that it's crucial that the military forces have a clear mission, and that the American public support cannot be maintained unless there is a clearly defined mission that the military is given. And then once they're given that clearly defined mission, then I think Colin would, and I think any of the senior military leadership would, proceed to do it. But that's been the problem in so many of these cases, is the absence in Bosnia and earlier in Somalia.
But Joe, that's a little bit like saying buy low and sell high. You know,
yeah,
it's a nice maxim. But in the real world, it's rather confusing out there. Sometimes you can't spell out a clear objective, but that in no way should inhibit the President of the United States from exercising his responsibility to use his military force to look after the best interest of the United States.
Yeah.
And unpredictability and surprise are very effective in containing an enemy anywhere, and we know that. So if you can predict based on a doctrine what someone's going to do. But I think you'll find that General Powell is a very pragmatic officer, and I would respect him to not get us in a situation like that. The interesting thing to me, John, about the political generals, admirals, is that they're there. I mean, we passed Vietnam when some of us could not wear our uniforms in the public in some cities in this country, to a point where these people are recognized as a part of our fabric and important to us, and I think that's a good sign.
Gentlemen, sadly we're running out of time. I'd like to thank all of you for enlightening us and giving some additional dimensions to this intriguing topic. I'd like to thank our studio audience made up of communications students and ROTC cadets from Brigham Young University for the International Media Study Program in the Department of Communications at Brigham Young University. I'm John Hughes. Thank you for being with us.